The parchment absorbed candlelight the way dry earth drinks sudden rain, every pale fiber brightening when Ayla laid down the first black stroke. The brush hardly seemed to touch the sheet. Instead, the ink leapt toward its own likeness, splaying into a perfect serif, a flourishing barbed curve that would have taken a lesser hand a dozen minutes to shape. This was Oren Elazar's greatest secret. The mark wanted to be made. Ayla's master sat across the oak drafting table, fingertips pressed together, gray eyes reflecting the shimmer of living pigment. Slowly, he murmured, "Let the glyph taste the air, then feed it the next letter." Ayla obeyed, angling the hair-fine wolf-tail brush. Beneath the point, the line she had just coaxed onto the contract shivered alive, and uncoiled the faintest tendril, so thin it could have been a crack in the surface. The new limb slipped across the parchment, searching for the edge of the margin, then rested, sated. Beside it, the nobleman who had commissioned the document cleared his throat. Baron Halvek of the East Ox was not accustomed to waiting. The man looked permanently sunburnt, his beard trimmed to daggers, yet as Ayla worked, the Baron's impatience mellowed into a rapt stare. He watched the letters rather than the woman shaping them, like a moth listening to the geometry of flame. Only when the final period bloomed round as a spider's egg did Oren push the blackwood quill toward his client. "Your seal, my lord," Halvek signed. At once the blot of his signature quivered, fissured, and sprouted inkroot. Thread-like shoots dashed across the page, some disappearing beneath others, weaving a mat of calligraphy too fine for mortal penmanship. The Baron stiffened as the vines circled his name, then relaxed, eyes glazing in sluggish approval. Oren sanded the sheet, blew gently, and folded it with mathematic precision. "The contract is complete. Your shipwrights will deliver 12 vessels by midsummer. In exchange, the Crown awards you exclusive rights to export iron." "Of course," Halvek breathed. He bowed, not to Oren, but to the parchment now cradled in his hands like an infant with brittle bones. The moment the door thumped shut behind him, Ayla asked, "Did you see his pupils? They widened when the ink crossed his signature." "An expected side effect," said Oren, wiping his pen. "A flush of certainty. Clients find it pleasant." "Pleasant?" she echoed. She had felt that flush herself, more than once, when Oren allowed her to sign for receipt of wages, for custody of courier satchels, for entry into the workshop at night. The sensation was like warm syrup poured through the skull, reassuring but indisputable. Ayla glanced at the pot of pigment. It looked harmless enough, a dull black slurry that smelled faintly of loam after rain. Yet she knew its origin. Filamented capstalks that grew only in the slaughterhouse caverns under Castle Dresa. Mushrooms that glowed violet when pried from corpse-rich soil. Fungi the miners called devil's scribes. She had helped harvest them once. The men they'd passed in the tunnels had worn iron collars, each engraved in Oren's script. They carried pickaxes but swung them with the obedient rhythm of a metronome. No one spoke, no one needed to. The collars made language redundant. And that memory still lifted her from sleep, gasping. Oren rolled his shoulders. "We have 2 hours before the next patron." He almost smiled, the tight, weary stretch of lips that, to her secret shame, had once seemed kindly. "You may rest." Rest was the last thing Ayla intended. Their quarters perched in a loft above the workshop, just high enough for a sliver of moon to peek through the lattice. Ayla lit no lamp. Instead, she opened her notebook to a leaf she kept blank and whispered, "If ink can bind, perhaps ink can break." Weeks earlier, she had diluted a single droplet of Oren's pigment in spring water and painted an invisible glyph beside a tavern girl's name on a pawn contract. The girl had returned the next day, tore her contract in two, and laughed before running into the street, debt forgotten, so liberation was possible. But the experiment had been tiny, fragile. To free the barren shipwrights, the iron collars in the mines, and whoever else had been netted by Oren's living calligraphy, she needed to desiccate the source, the mushrooms. A tap sounded at the shutters, 3 quick raps, one slow. "Soren." She eased the window open. Soren pulled himself inside, all elbows and storm-soaked hair. His coat dripped on her floorboards. I watched Halvek leave, he said. Contract in his carriage. Looked drunk. Drunk on compulsion, Ayla replied. Soren's jaw flexed. He was no stranger to Oren's craft. The foreman who'd overseen the seizure of his family's orchard had walked away with one of the Cliviker's scrolls tucked under his arm. 2 days later, Soren's parents signed away their deeds, voluntarily. The orchard withered unused. The family scattered. Soren joined the hidden circles that printed pamphlets beneath taverns and whispered about revolution. He removed a folded map from his boot. I found a back entrance to the caverns. If we burn the grow rooms, Oren loses his ink. But we must move tonight, before Halvik delivers those ships, before your master inks half the kingdom. Ayla swallowed. She imagined the soft lattice of mushroom gills, the sorrowful scent of damp spores. The caverns are guarded? Not anymore. Soren smiled grimly. The guards answered to Halvik. He's too busy admiring his new iron charter. Her heart thumped. We'll need lanterns and salt. Salt? To shrivel the mycelium. Fire alone might scatter spores. Soren squeezed her shoulder. Meet me at the southeast sewer gate in an hour. Ayla descended the staircase into the deserted workshop. Moonlight silvered Oren's instruments. Brass compasses, gemstone protractors, knives honed for splitting quills into whispers. The ink pot sat at the center like a black heart. She took an empty vial from a cabinet and, hands trembling, siphoned 2 spoonfuls of pigment. The stuff clung to glass as if reluctant to be stolen. She stoppered it, tucked it into her bodice, then gathered a canvas satchel corks of salt, flint, sealed candles. As she crossed the threshold, a voice drifted from the shadows. Leaving so soon? Oren stepped out, robe loose, silver hair unbraided. In his right hand he held a scroll that pulsed faintly, as though breathing. Ayla froze. Master, I was fetching more supplies. Liar, but brave. He almost sounded proud. I suspected you'd tasted scruples. 4 nights ago you liberated a barmaid. An elegant alteration, but crude roots. He lifted the scroll. The city guard found this outside the tavern. My handwriting, her name, but not my contract. Amateur discrepancies. Her pulse hammered. She was forced into debt. I freed her. You interfered, he corrected gently, with an economy of obedience that prevents war. Think of the chaos if every merchant, lord, and soldier woke one morning unbound from promise. He paced toward her. The floor creaked like an old throat. Imagine duels at dawn, fleets deserting harbors, priests denying alms. The city collapses. Or breathes, Ayla whispered, for the first time. Oren regarded her as one might regard a painting, hung slightly crooked. Annoyance tempered by affection. Your talent is immense. I loathe to waste it. From his robe he produced a slim contract, blank but for a single sentence. I will obey the will of Oren Elisar for the stability of Rangel City. The letters shimmered, half-formed, eager for companionship. Sign, he said, offering a quill already wet with living ink. Tendrils licked the nib, waiting. Ayla's chest constricted. If she took that quill, her rebellion would vanish like chalk in rain. She thought of the iron-collared miners, Soren's orchard, the girl whose laughter had spun like gold sun beyond the tavern door. So she ran. Oren cursed. The workshop's doors slammed behind her, lock sliding home of its own accord on his command. But Ayla knew this place intimately. She dashed between drafting tables, knocked over a brazier, coals scattered, igniting rolled scrap. Red light bloomed, smoke choking the air. She hurled herself through a narrow side hatch used for deliveries, skidded into the alley. The contract wind snatched her braid as Oren shouted inside, summoning ink to chase her, but fire slowed him. Flames hated parchment. Ayla sprinted toward the sewer gate. Saren crouched beside the iron grate, lantern dark, salt sack slung across his back. When he saw her singed cloak, fear flickered. Are you hurt? Just smoked. Oren suspects everything. Then no more time for planning. He pried loose the grate. They slipped into a throat of brick that reeked of algae and rats. Water lapped their boots, chill with spring runoff. Soren led, left hand gliding against the wall, counting archways. At the fifth, he stopped. This is it. They climbed a ladder to a service hatch, emerged into abandoned catacombs. Bone niches gaped, emptied for noble family relocation decades ago. The path bent downward. Soon living glow met them. Faint violet sparks pulsed ahead. When you see the mushrooms, Ayla said, voice barely sound, cover your mouth, spores numb caution. The tunnel widened. What greeted them was less a garden than a cathedral. Columns of fungus rose like pillars, capped with umbrellas the size of shields. Bioluminescent veins pulsed, illuminating pools where ink dripped like sap into stone basins. The air tasted of copper and rainroot. Soren exhaled, awed despite dread. All this for handwriting. Ayla sprinkled a circle of salt around the entrance, in case the ink tries to slip away. They moved between towers, scattering salt, uncorking oil flasks. Ayla paused beside a shallow basin. Floating atop the black liquid was an iridescent film as thin as skin. She touched it with a metal stylus. Letters formed a formless greeting. The film wanted to speak. She recoiled, flinging droplets. Where they landed, the floor sprouted miniature vines that searched in vain for flesh. Soren poured lamp oil onto stalks. Townspark? On 3, Ayla said. But watch for roots. They'll try to strangle if threatened. They counted. Flames rippled along the oil, climbed mushrooms, turned violet into screaming orange. The heat smelled of pepper and night soil. Caps burst like bloated wineskins. Spores frothed but collided with salt lines and died hissing. Ayla coughed, eyes burning. Basins next. But a voice thundered through the cavern. Basins next. But a voice thundered through the cavern. Basins next. But a voice thundered through the cavern. Basins next. But a voice thundered through the cavern. Basins? Orrin stood at the main stair, robe pocketing flame light. Behind him 4 guards advanced, each wearing parchment strips across their brows like cultic diadems. Their expressions were serene beyond fear. Orrin raised a slender staff. The tip carried no jewel, only a liquid nib wreathed in living ink. He dashed a glyph in midair. The ink hovered, luminous. Instantly, tendrils erupted from the cavern floor, newborn limbs lashing toward Ayla and Soren. Soren slashed one with his knife. The cut piece wriggled, seeking purchase. More wrapped his ankles. He fell with a cry. Ayla smashed a salt pouch upon the vines. They recoiled, shriveling like hot wax. She dragged Soren upright, but guards encircled them. Orrin approached. Sweat gleamed his temples. The man was breathing smoke, yet his eyes glittered triumphant. Ignorant child, he told Ayla over the roar of burning fungus. I offered mercy, now you'll watch him sign. A guard extended a contract. It already bore Soren's name, as though time folded to Orrin's convenience. The guard placed a quill against Soren's limp fingers. Ayla yelled, Soren, don't! But ink trickled onto his skin, sketching letters across his knuckles, coaxing them closed upon the quill. He shuddered, fight draining. The quill tapped the contract, leaving a single dot enough. Tendrils sprouted, racing toward his wrist. Ayla hurled herself between them. She smashed her last salt flask on the page, eroding half the words. The living ink splashed backward, sizzling. Orrin growled and traced another glyph in the air, commanding vines to strangle her. They struck, but the vial she'd stolen earlier, pure pigment pressed in her palm like a heart. Desperate, she uncorked it and flung it at Orrin. Mid-sleight, the ink obeyed its maker's unspoken longing for order. The droplet elongated, unfurled, and wove itself into script even before it struck Orrin's chest, a mirror of the binding phrase he had forced upon countless others. But inverted. Instead of, I will obey the will of Orrin Elisar, it wrote, Orrin Elisar will obey the will of those he has bound. The line slapped across his robe, adhered to flesh. Tendrils shot inward, piercing his skin like needles of ice. Orrin gasped, stumbled. The floating glyph he'd drawn dissipated. Ayla seized the moment. She guided Soren's trembling hand to the half-ruined contract and rewrote the final clause with her stylus dipped in salt slurry. The signer's will returns, unshackled. When Soren dotted the sentence, the ink vines lacing his wrist loosened, then withered. Guards blinked, disoriented. Their parchment diadems blackened, cracked, and fell. One dropped his spear and wept. Oren struggled upright, eyes wild. "Release me," he croaked. "You are released," Ayla said softly. "To everyone else's will." She faced the former guards, the newly conscious laborers spilling in from adjacent tunnels, drawn by the noise. "He is yours to judge." Yet pity stirred. Oren had taught her every nuance of line weight and curvature, every breathy law of negative space. She stepped to him, took his stained hand. "Where did you learn the mushroom's secret?" she asked. His voice rasped like burnt paper. "From a monastery beyond the shale desert. They believe surrender is holy." He laughed bitterly. "I made it profitable." Flames devoured the remaining stalks, illuminating caves where ink basins boiled dry. Ayla felt the contract's hold on Oren tug at her conscience. She could command him to walk into the fire, and he would. Instead, she led him out, through collapsing corridors, into night cooled by river breeze. Dawn smeared coral across the sky, while smoke from the caverns drifted behind them like grave cloths unrolled. In a field beyond city walls, refugees of Oren's ink gathered, miners rubbing raw necks, scribes who'd copied enslaving texts, clerks whose signatures had mortgaged their futures. Soren and other revolutionaries distributed water, crusts, maps of safe houses. Every so often someone would kneel at Ayla's feet, lips trembling, and she would tell them, "Stand, your will is yours." Oren sat beneath an altar, shackled by rope rather than ink now. His gaze wandered, perhaps tasting a freedom exquisitely bitter. No voice in his head explaining his path, only the weather and his crimes. Soren approached Ayla, haloed by sunrise. "Many still wear contracts on their skin," he said, "but their minds feel clear. We think the clauses are dead-root system burned." "Not dead," Ayla replied. "Dormant seeds may linger. We'll need watchfulness." He touched her soot-streaked cheek. "We, then?" She realized she'd been standing on the rim of flight, unsure whether to vanish into anonymity, but her fingers still itched for quill and parchment. She could teach writing that healed instead of bound. "Yes," she said. Behind them, Oren spoke hoarsely. "Ayla." She stepped closer. "I have nothing to offer," he said. "No power, no coin. Yet, when I sleep, the ink still moves beneath my eyelids. It wants instruction. Please." His voice broke. "Tell it to be still." The contract on his chest shimmered faintly, obeying all freed will around him, and she was among that number. Compassion is a kind of order, she thought, softer but sturdier than any chain. She knelt, dipped a twig in clean ink she had mixed at Dongal, water, soot, and a droplet of her blood, nothing more. On the inside of Oren's wrist she wrote a single character, "Shu," the old tongue's word for silence. The mark pulsed once, then lay flat as ordinary pigment. Oren exhaled, eyes closing not in compulsion but respite. "Rest," she said. Weeks later, printers across Rangel sold broadsheets announcing the assembly of unshackled trades. Membership required only one thing, a thumbprint beneath Ayla's new charter, inscribed in ink that lay inert after drying, respectful as a loyal dog. The charter declared that no promise had merit without the signer's daily renewal, an act of will perpetually revocable. Most merchants scoffed, but workers, sailors, messengers, seamstresses, and a surprising number of soldiers queued under the paper lanterns to press ink-back thumbs upon the parchment, smiling at the plainness of its letters. "I don't know who sold you," Liz replied. They renewed their prints the next morning, and the next, and eventually the habit of conscious choice became fashion. As for Oren Elisar, he served probation copying books of poetry in an abbey on the northern cliff. He used ordinary ink. Sometimes, when a stanza particularly pleased him, he allowed himself a gentle flourish, a leaf, a spiral, an echo of living lines restrained by humility. The paper bore them calmly, and they stayed where he put them. Ayla visited once, bringing fresh nibs. Oren thanked her and returned to his copying. She watched his steady hand, then left him to his page. Outside, myrtle bloomed. She inhaled, savoring the mundane scent of earth without sorcery. Soren waited by the gate with 2 horses and a bundle of empty scrolls. Together they would journey east, teaching villages to read their own rights, to salt their ink, to sign only what their uncoerced hearts could bear. They rode out as the sun climbed, its light a pure, unbinding gold, under which every script was merely speech, and every signer answered to nothing but the quiet sovereign inside their chest.